Thank you so much for the privilege and honor to present my research to you, music teachers and researchers in Korea. I'm coming to you from my home in New York, and my dear friend, student at NYU, 19 years old now, but I saw her growing up down the hall. She's helping me film this presentation for you, so thank you, Benita. And thank you for the invitation again to speak. So I would like to talk a bit about what I learned in the last 16 months as a university music educator during the trials and tribulations of teaching remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic. While writing this presentation, I was also reading Albert Camus' The Plague, and it was so prescient that I began collecting quotes from that book and interspersing them into this presentation. So the first one begins with Dr. Ryu, who took it upon himself to record the world that he was living in.
Dr. Ryu resolved to compile this chronicle so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done to them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in a time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise.
Thrown into emergency remote teaching by the global pandemic of 2020, in the middle of a semester no less, music teachers around the world were faced with unprecedented challenges. We were told to be resilient and flexible. We were told to adapt. But unless we were already teaching online, music instruction through Zoom made no sense. Worse, the rupture took place literally overnight. Those of us who were university music teacher educators began building the plane while flying it, all the while trying to model what good building the plane while flying it looked like. Like you, I won't forget the avalanche events of the spring of 2020. Maybe you were working with a violin group outside of Seoul or directing a choir in Busan. I was teaching a graduate music education course in New York here, through which collaborative composing was facilitated in small working groups. I was trying to model a student-centered, democratic classroom, already hard enough. You, me, all of us, we muddled through the confusions and breaks that ensued. As teachers, we had no choice but to lean into our students and learn from the nearest source. Next came the summer of 2020, bringing an even greater confluence of events, a world movement to fight police brutality, racism, and sexism, personal isolation and loneliness, and portents of grief emerging from my family and the news. Out of crisis teaching came surprises, in particular, new teaching strategies and pedagogical insights. My curricula changed quickly and dramatically, almost as if out of my hands. Virtual classes became spaces of intense togetherness, even community. And my students' creative work took on new flights of intimacy and revelation. I began to take notes like a beginning teacher. There were lessons to be learned. The great rupture of 2020, I better see now, augured new visions and new possibilities for music education. Now, we can't know what music teaching will look like in 5 years or even 6 months, but we can ask ourselves what we learned from this experience, from this year. This is the topic of my presentation. The insights I want to talk about are informed by the university music teacher preparation courses I taught, the notes I took, and what my music education graduate students revealed to me in their creative work during this time. I organized this presentation into 4 broad themes, put together by the surprises and pedagogical adjustments I made during this time. The themes deal with 1, portfolio-based learning, 2, curriculum making, 3, student health and well-being, and 4, new forms of dialogue. I end each of the sections with excerpts from the notes I took during 2020. I hope they generate discussion. The first theme, the forced rescue of portfolio-based learning. And here's a quote from Kmes.
From now on, it can be said that plague was the concern of all of us. Hitherto, surprised as he may have been by the strange things happening around him, each individual citizen had gone about his business as usual, so far as it was possible, and no doubt he would have continued doing so. But once the town gates were shut, every one of us realized that all, the narrator included, were, so to speak, in the same boat, and each would have to adapt himself to the new conditions of life.
Overnight, again, no exaggeration, music teachers went from directing ensembles and teaching lessons to a kind of project-based learning that took place online, alone, in caregiver homes and apartments. Maybe there were early adaptations of virtual choirs and virtual bands, but most music teachers I know were forced to construct individualized electronic portfolios, e-portfolios, in which students would submit work for evaluation and monitoring. With, say, hundreds of portfolios to review and direct, the traditional teacher-centered instructional model became impossible to sustain. Based simply on the economics of time, students were allowed more say in what they wanted to do. To greater and lesser degrees, creative, student-centered, portfolio-based music education re-emerged in North America, though mostly without strategy, mostly without professional development or teacher facilitation. Anecdotally, it was reported to me that much of this teaching was a mess. But an opportunity presents itself. Competitions, sit-down exams, adjudicated contests were now impossible, thus auguring new ways to explore music outside the master-apprentice dogma that I had long fought to dismantle in my own theory and practice. The return of portfolio learning. I never thought it would happen. I remember being a graduate student in the 1990s, and project learning was all the rage. Howard Gardner and Nelson Goodman's work at Harvard University's Project Zero was one source of inspiration. This is the 90s. Emphasizing creativity and problem solving, their Harvard research helped music teachers enlarge a disciplinary field that was mostly product-driven and behavior-based. Creativity and problem solving, moreover, were process goals that looked different across disciplines and were experienced differently by each learner. From this vantage point, portfolios were a natural location for diverse learners to showcase their multiple interests and findings, but more importantly, to showcase how and why they came to their multiple interests and findings. My vision of portfolio learning is shaped by that moment in history, but I revel in greater potentials for beauty, protest, and even messiness. Music portfolios, I explain to my students, can be analogous to those giant leather satchels that art majors carry with them across campus. If you ask an art major to look inside, they'll show you scraps of markered up napkins, unfinished nudes, completed cityscapes in ink or pastel, notes from class critique. I recently learned about Da Vinci's notebooks, Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, wherein physics, desire, formal beauty are woven together page after page with strange cursive notes, both ridiculous and brilliant. Missing from Da Vinci's notes and missing in Project Zero's conception of portfolio learning, however, is an outlet for anger. Whether dealing with racial injustice or forthright assertions of identity, my students' portfolio this year contained music that was culturally provocative, located often in pain, but still filled with hope and healing. The portfolios were easily digitalized, and we ended the semester sharing excerpts, laughing, and sometimes crying. Before this national reemergence of project learning, it is worth recalling that portfolio-based learning came to a crashing halt in the early 2000s with the advent of big tech, and a global standards movement that could absorb countless derivations of student and teacher data. Whether trustworthy or not, learning benchmarks created stabilized variables that could be compared and assessed, with concomitant punishments and rewards for learners, teachers, schools, and even nation states. Yes, portfolios were nice, the story went, but they lacked value. They couldn't prove anything, well, because difference vis-a-vis effort, intention, difference via culture, interest, style, was just too hard to compare, and thus, logically for them, portfolios were fundamentally non-objective. Today, an important lesson emerges from the momentary collapse of standardized testing, as sit-down, group-surveilled, memory-based examinations are impossible to conduct on account of an airborne contagion. American universities and colleges are reporting record numbers of diverse applicants and are accepting record numbers of Black, Brown, and Indigenous students. Alternative criteria for what counts as good or worthy were necessarily turned to. The lesson for music educators' future, the lessons are obvious. Learning standards devalue diversity. The rubrics attached to learning standards silence students' voices, and they narrow creativity. And there are always alternative and multiple criteria for what counts as good. Second theme, curriculum as assemblage.
But public welfare is merely the sum total of the private welfares of each of us.
Learning remotely has re-emphasized to me that our students are fully formed, fully encultured, complex persons who are endowed with private histories, public politics, identities, and multiple ways of seeing and knowing. Watching learning take place from an individual's home, hotel, or apartment exposed a subtle truth. Too often, students leave part of who they are and who they are becoming when they enter a school or take a seat in our classroom. Although my teaching philosophy is strongly influenced by John Dewey's educational and moral concepts of growth, Maxine Green's notions of becoming, I see more clearly that students, no matter what age, are paradoxically both complete and both unfinished. Yes, it is our job to foster expansions of life and living, but I'm newly interested in growth without prescription, without deficit thinking, or heavy-handed instructional design. If this vision of teaching sounds like a contradiction, it is one I have come to enjoy immensely. And this contradiction, it is a process and an aim that we can strive to prolong within our curriculum. Curriculum can be designed to capture the contradictions of growth without prescription even operating according to a paralogic of structured openness. I like to think of curriculum as a rhizomatic assemblage of texts that interact without an anchor, a tapestry that seeks an unattributing posture, a plural that refuses filiation. The concept traces back to Gilles Deleuze and borrows from Roland Barthes' notion of the text. However, one can draw curricular inspiration from contemporary music production as well, especially the ways in which hip-hop musicians make and communicate their art. Like the sources I draw from, a decentered curriculum is piecemeal, a mound, an open plain, an anthill, a rabbit's burrow. It's something without a beginning or end, it's some kind of middle place. I noticed that curriculum as assemblage became more pronounced when students were learning from home, using the unique resources around them as they explored and put to use our group discussions. One principle of assemblage is that a class never explores one piece of music alone or one topic from a singular source. Long before remote teaching in 2020, I enjoyed mixing styles and genres by theme. For example, we might look at how male composers write women into existence. Or we might take a concept, say prioritizing texture and timbre, but as first-order compositional devices. Designing for openness, I structure a concept for wide discussion and subsequent laboratory exploration. We might begin with Toro y Moi, or Henry Cowell's use of texture and timbre, and put them side by side. Students working remotely are encouraged to use the resources around them to improvise and compose, thereby emphasizing and extending home life, yet also inserting and celebrating the unique cultures and languages that they bring to the mix. Using the technological platform that facilitates our virtual space, we grow our mound, our anthill of stuff, adding link after link to an initial assemblage. Naturally, students return from their explorations and share aspects of who they are, where they are, or who they are becoming. Revelations ensue. Now, if you know me, then you know I'm terrible at technology, even a bit phobic. A music teacher better versed in technology would almost certainly create far greater vistas of synchronous, asynchronous, cooperative, and real virtual circuitry than me, better than me. They might create learning webs that sidestep the natural linear shape of teacher-directed learning. Teaching through Zoom was a matrix I reluctantly stepped a foot into, but one from which now I take unexpected inspiration. The designs of assemblage cohere nicely with two important aspirations for music educators. Technology can unleash and facilitate curricular remixing and help to reorbit the student as the priority of learning. Two, a decentered curriculum is, or should be, a decolonizing space, resulting in a greater diversity of voices across time, culture, and interest. Third theme, loss, trauma, therapy, and well-being.
So you haven't understood yet? Rambert shrugged his shoulders almost scornfully. Understood what? The plague. Ryu exclaims. No, you haven't understood that it means exactly that. The same thing over and over and over again.
I have been an educator a long time, and I know, like you, that we all carry within us private histories of loss and suffering. our students do too. Yet, I have never seen so many public intersections of pain and trauma as I witnessed over the course of the pandemic. In profound ways, my students and I needed each other this year. I don't know how else to put it. We embraced trust and mutuality in spite of this flattened digital space that seemed antithetical to these conditions. As artists do, we made the best of our resources. We told stories of fragile courage. Out of these stories came some degree of hope, but so too a heaviness I just couldn't shake. I went in search of healing and calm. I found myself purposefully designing instruction that addressed personal well-being and mental health. I became interested in the ways in which the ancients in China used music as a healing practice, what the Singaporean scholar Leonard Tan calls Ming Xin, Jian Xin, or the clearing of the heart-mind, the exploration of the inner life. As a class, we tried to approach our instruments differently than how we were trained. More like meditative tools, more like the scholars in ancient China who performed the Gu Qin as a way of self-knowing and wonder. Could we refuse musical thinking so prized and privileged in Western music education? Refuse metacognition even. For what? A paracognitive experience of nothingness? A passage to elsewhere? We looked at Pauline Oliveros' musical meditations and designed warm-ups that used her twin concepts of breath and deep listening. Koji Matsunobu, the Japanese scholar, in his article, Performing, Creating, and Listening to Nature Through Music, The Art of Self-Integration, took my class outside. We played music with birds and the wind, and like Koji did with his students in Tokyo, like the ancients did in Japan a long time ago, we spoke with the birds. I talked with my doctoral student, Lindsay, who designed a research study around singing, contemplation, and mindfulness. Inspired, I tried meditating for the first time in my life. Were the results successful? Did I know enough to act? Was I appropriately grounded in these practices? How far was I permitted to explore outside my culture, life experience, and expertise? The answer to all these questions were, probably not, sometimes, under certain conditions, who knows, what else could I do? At the same time that I was looking for personal healing, I was also dealing with anger and self-doubt myself. Protests against police brutality were rocking my Harlem neighborhood, and my heart ached for those who died. For the month of June last year, during every night the month of June, fireworks lit up the sky, preventing sleep. I tried to sharpen my practice as an anti-racist teacher. Was I qualified to facilitate the kind of intense abolitionist teaching that was needed in this moment? And when would I know that I was ready? Was I qualified to be a therapist? What if I did harm to my students? I have come to appreciate that there are phases in a teacher's life when time affords us the luxury to fine-tune a practice. But there are many more moments, running perhaps through all of life, when we are outside the required expertise to feel comfortable and safe. I assert, nonetheless, that although we may be without expertise in an area that requires attention and haste, we are not without tools. We can draw upon dialogue or employ alternative pedagogy, such that students lead or share when we cannot. Here I present another case for diversity. In homogeneous communities, or in spaces of standardization and external evaluation, we are effectively prevented from drawing upon expertise that we don't possess. overly homogenized communities or rubric-driven curricula may prevent us from exploring alternative pedagogies and alternative pathways. We might rush into cultural spaces where humbleness and caution are better approaches. And here we are presented with another paradox, another aphorism. We can pivot quickly, but we must do so with caution. We cannot let undue caution prevent us from meeting the moment that demands speed. Theme 4, dialogue, witnessing, and quiet pedagogy.
Whereas in the early days of the plague, they had been struck by the host of small details that, while meaning absolutely nothing to others, meant so much to them personally, and thus had realized, perhaps for the first time, the uniqueness of each man's life.
As a university music teacher-educator, it is my job to model a teaching practice that is informed by theory. I won't present a theory in class that I can't point to in practice. This imperative is aspirational and not always successful, but it is an ethical posture I hold myself to. Thus, it is hard to overstate the surprise I felt this year when a practice I held dear changed in front of me. A closely held theory transformed, but without conscious strategy on my part. Remote learning, creative portfolio-based teaching, and student well-being has reconfigured how dialogue plays out in my classroom. I have always used classroom dialogue as a principal method for flattening the hierarchies that have historically worked against the creation of a more open music learning environment and performance practice. My problem with master-apprentice teaching and its praxis of student docility permeates much of my research. In search of a more emancipatory literacy, I came to a theory of the text, whereby each reader brings the fullness of their lives and the uniqueness of their vantage point to a classroom encounter. There is an expectation that not only will each student see, feel, and hear differently, but that a classroom profits when reports from multiple vantage points are considered and debated. I like to talk about dialogue as producing surplus meaning. If an object of attention has only singular meaning or comes from a closed standard of practice, it is probably not worth studying, at least in my classes. Curriculum in the humanities is the art of bringing together rich mounds, rich anthills of provocation to produce the kinds of multi-directional spillover that enlarge and enrich life. It can be said that the gravitational pull of authority forever disallows the student a place at the center of interest. Whether we are talking about a code of practice, a dead composer's score, or a teacher's earned expertise, the music learner is always the last to speak. What if the reader, what if the student speaks before the author has his say? What if we performed without explication? What if a composer's intentions were just one part of a mound that included an audience's interpretations, a decentered tradition, amendable codes of practice, and unlimited links and passageways to the unconsidered and previously silenced? Dialogue helps reorbit the student as the center of pull. When a group of diverse learners comes in close contact, the topics, the conversations, the activities push and pull apart, moving erratically from location to location. The effect can be destabilizing, exhausting, but exhilarating. This year, to my surprise, a different energy and affect emerged. The change had something to do with a digital video platform that doesn't allow for simultaneous discussion or the rhythms of excited interruption. Our flattened space created quieter conversations. But the primary change, I think, had to do with the ways in which my students were using their creative assignments to address issues of race, gender, isolation, and general anxiety. When students shared their creative work, a manner of silent respect often followed. We listened and watched, and suspended any kind of dialogical contest. There was no rush to opinionate, to opine, no point for point and counterpoint. Quite the opposite. Forceful dialogue became unnecessary because we were acting as witnesses to hurt, beauty, and struggle. Disclosure was a student-led praxis from which I too learned to be more quiet. What does it mean to practice quiet dialogue or quiet assessment? Is this a new praxis? Is this a new practice? Or is this just new for me? Last summer, as my students' creative work evinced increasing emotion and pain, our class began to refer to quietness as witnessing. As the practice of quietness took shape, I recognized its potential for enlarging empathy and togetherness. Witnessing, our class decided, had something to do with informed action, maybe as when James Baldwin calls our attention to the atrocities of racial injustice, writing as a form of testifying. David Hansen uses the term witnessing to evoke a receptive orientation to the commonly profound, appealing to the dignity of human work, specifically the act of teaching. In my class, we were not merely beholding revelation, though certainly we were, nor were we merely practicing empathy, though, again, certainly we were. We were growing, becoming otherwise, and our choices were purposeful. Witnessing, thus, had everything to do with the very meaning and purpose of education. Since our witnessing occurred after we shared work from our portfolios, its practice reorbited the place of explication back to where it has greatest value, in the learner's hands. Sharing learner intentions, creators' feelings and discoveries. As a classroom of diverse learner witnesses, we noticed generally the value of the new dialogical method and noticed differently the value of each person's offerings. There is nothing inherently wrong with explication, even in a theory of the text. Explication is oppressive when dialogue is disallowed, as when a conductor decides the range of choices his orchestra is afforded to make, or when notation and style are treated without strata as autochthonous rock. Explication in the hands of the vulnerable is a different story. For one thing, it means that the rights of the reader are deferred, though never foreclosed. When a student shares vulnerable work, our job is to attend, to be alert, and wait. We notice. We contemplate. This kind of evaluation, hearing where value or emphasis is placed, observing values' affect on oneself and others, considering why certain choices are made and where these choices come from, is at last worthy of the richness of our students' lives. When a student feels the need to share anger or pain, there is no justifiable place for rubrics or backwards designed assignments. Yes, a quiet evaluation occurs, but the observation and location of value is a sideways event, becoming para-analytical, embodying the projection and reception of feelings, leaving judgment more in the hands of the maker and less in the critic, usually the teacher. Assessment and evaluation as educative concepts are recovered by a contemplative praxis of valuing and noticing. I heard you say this. What did you mean? Or, I noticed this choice. Say more about it. In my notes from 2020, I began to wonder about what I was calling loud pedagogy. Was my concept of dialogue too loud, my previous concept, or did it lack dimension and nuance? What would it mean to better appreciate the envelope within which the sounds of learning occur? To really attune to wider dialogic frequencies, durations, volumes, and all the echoes of the reception and decay. In my notes, I recall that Socrates was a loud pedagogue, and I've come to disavow his pedagogy of confrontation. Here, Socrates was a teacher who gave himself the task of educating the unwilling, mostly through unsolicited argument with them. We know the story. In Socrates' mind, ancient Athens was a slumbering horse and he was a gadfly, a fly ready to sting a lazy polity to his vision of wide awakeness. Couldn't quiet conversations, I wonder, even between naps, have worked just as well? Why do we confuse volume with knowing and loudness with insight? Talk to a beginner who is learning a new language. Greater volume will not help you understand a word that you have not learned or cannot recognize. Greater volume will not help you understand a cultural phenomenon that you have not experienced or cannot recognize. Loudness might agitate, but it is in the quiet comment that brings me closer to you and what you wish to share with me. Here are some of my notes on dialogue. Conclusion: the new 21st century musician.
In normal times, all of us know, whether consciously or not, that there is no love which can't be bettered.
The least controversial prediction I can offer for the future of music education is that remote learning has enlarged our teaching toolkit as well as our empathy. As the year progressed, I was forced to admit that Zoom teaching was not the educational malpractice I thought it would be. Emergency conditions were off, and as I recounted in this presentation, new things happened. My personal prejudice against online education melted away, to my surprise. My all-remote doctoral seminar, for example, is a space of comfortable equality, with the exception of a few time zone differences. And although I don't like cats, it is fun to see them pop up on my students' screens, and even nicer to know that these normally stressed out dissertation researchers are working from the comfort of their most comfortable chair, with their favorite companion nearby, human or otherwise. In a seminar setting, the flattened space allows for the easy sharing of written work, and I can more confidently manage conversations and time. Going forward, I haven't figured out what role remote learning will play in my two-part creativity class. This is the course with the portfolios. But I am sure that I will not try to replicate what occurred in the semesters before time 2020. I feel confident predicting that most music teachers will do the same. We will reflect on what worked, think about what didn't, and we will inevitably change how we teach. It's exciting to contemplate. I would like to offer another prediction for the future, also without controversy. COVID-19 has reshaped what it means to be a performing artist, and it has forced our music majors to enlarge their skills, even their understanding of what it means to be an artist. Theater, dance, and music have awkwardly moved to remote production stages, and through this painful process, new techniques and skills are being achieved. Today, the visual artist David Hockney, I think he's in his 80s, paints exclusively on his iPhone and iPad. GPS tracking allows anyone with a cell phone to explore parks and cityscapes accompanied by sound art of all manner. Last week, near me, a pop-up jazz quartet played live on a Harlem stoop with a tap dancer along with the musicians. In a traditional study of aesthetics, we ask, what is art? I think it's more interesting to ask, where is art, or when is art? Remote teaching has revealed that music making and music sharing are eminently uncontainable, never limited to production studios, concert stages, or practice rooms. Nor does composing depend upon an upright piano in the aforementioned cramped practice room. In 2020, we made music from household objects, the call of geese, traditional sources, as well as squishy loops and stems found online and made up new. By composing alone or collaborating with others from home, stunning music videos emerged throughout the year. Though I never specified an aesthetic form that the students or group should adopt. I saw reflections on nationality from a spoken word video that took inspiration from the great Harlem poet Langston Hughes' poem, I Too Sing America, Langston Hughes' remix of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. I heard ruminations on race from a white student as he walked through a starry sky in Little Rock, Arkansas. There is politics in music, an obvious point finally internalized by my many classically trained student musicians. I joke with them that they have jumped from the 19th century into the 21st century in 1 year's time, skipping the 20th century completely. I watched as these classical musicians, many of whom had never used recording and composing software before, write moving stories about society and self. It wasn't long ago that music education researchers thought that drum sets and guitars would revolutionize music education by instantly bringing popular culture and popular society into the traditional curriculum. Then we recognized a collective prejudice. It takes just as much time to learn the guitar as it does the violin. Perhaps this insight brings me to a final observation. While I generally agree that there is no easy instrument to learn, it does appear from 2020 that we can learn production skills rather quickly, especially in diverse peer groups. We have succeeded, I think, at the arrival of genre agnosticism and a concomitant reordering of power. The field of music education has become more open. Our students are showing us what they can do. I aspire to learn more from them.